Luckily, the account representative knew CPR, written by David Foster Wallace in 1989. An account representative, newly divorced, finished another late evening of work at his office, in accounts. It was well past 10. In another office, at the opposite end of a different floor, the firm's vice president in charge of overseas production, married for almost 30 years, grandfather of one, also finished working late. Both men left. There were between these last two executives to leave the building the sorts of similarities enjoyed by parallel lines. Each man, leaving, balanced his weight against that of a heavy, slender briefcase. Monograms and company logos flanked handles of leathered metal, which each man held. Each man, on his separate empty floor, moved down white-lit halls over whispering, and mealy and monochromatic carpet, toward elevators that each sat open-mouthed and mute in its shaft along one of the large building's two accessible sides. Each man, passing through his department's hall, felt the special subsonic disquiet the overtime executive in topcoat and unfresh suit and loosened tie feels as he moves in nighttime through areas meant to be experienced in, and as daytime. Each received, to the varying degrees of their respective pains allowed, an intuition of the askew, as, in the neatly stacked slices of lit space between the executive and the distant lament of the custodian's vacuum, the building's very silence took on expression. They sensed, almost spinally, the slow release of great breath, a spatial sigh, a slight, sly movement of huge lids cracked in wakened affinity with the emptiness that was, after all, the reasonable executive realizes, half the building's total day. Realizes that the building not only took up, but organized space, contained the executive and not vice versa, that the building was not, after all, comprised of or by executives or staff. Particularly, the divorced account representative, who remarked silently, alone, as his elevator dropped towards the executive garage, that at a certain unnoticed but never unheeded point in every corporate evening he worked, it became time to leave. That this point in the overtime night was a fulcrum on which things basic and unseen tilted, very slightly, a pivot in hours unaware, and that in the period between this point and the fresh suited working dawn, the very issue of the building's ownership would become, quietly, in their absence, truly an issue, hung in air, unsettled. The account representative hung in air, dropping on his elevator's wire. This, again single, junior executive, was spare, lithe, had about him an air of extreme economy, was young for an executive, almost literally a junior executive, was most at ease with those he countenanced at a distance of several feet, and had a professional manner, with respect to the accounts he represented for the firm, describable along a continuum from smoothly capable to cold. His elevator descended with a compact hum that was usually hard to hear. The account representative's imported and clean white motor scooter leaned at the angle of its kickstand beside a solid and equally clean, broad broom of a car. These were the only vehicles left in the empty executive garage, below the staff garage, below the building's basement maintenance level. Now, well past 10, the building's deepest plane seemed very distant from everything else. The empty executive garage was enormous, broad, long, its ceiling a claustrophobic 8¼ feet, its barely overhead lights harshly yellow, its surfaces cement the tired color of much exhaust. The ding, trundle, and sigh of the account representative's elevator's closure produced echoes and echoes of echoes against and between the executive garage's gray stone planes, as did the click of the account representative's dress shoes and the jangled separation of his keys from his change. The silence of the place, complete and sensitive to disturbance, discouraged whistling. The executive garage smelled of automobile exhaust, something vaguely but thoroughly rubber, and the account representative. A humid stir of air moved through the garage. It came from the curving orifice of the exit ramp, located next to the reserved spaces, reserved for directors and operating officers, perhaps half a Turanian city block from the centrally parked Brougham and Cycle. The exit ramp spiraled darkly around and out of sight, up through the staff level and toward the silent, empty, municipally lit street above it. The account representative rounded the keel of the shiny black Brougham and was at his scooter when an elevator on the executive garage's opposite side trundled and sighed. His safety helmet was attached and locked to the cycle's tail clamp, was thus for now the cycle's only safety helmet, and the account representative, whose wife, from whom he was now legally separate, had been into the combined and confabulated sides of things, had a temporary experience of the helmeted scooter as Shetland Centaur, sprite-ridden, emptily and tinnily owned. Tonight's experience was very temporary, because the junior executive looked almost immediately past the cycle and across the garage toward the echo ding of its opposite elevator. The elevator disgorged the vice president in charge of overseas production, who moved stiffly, flushed, into the open, low, yellowed space of the executive garage. The account representative and the vice president in charge of overseas production knew each other only slightly, and only by sight, and the account representative had removed his contact lenses in the men's room in accounts before settling down into a long evening of close reading by white light. But since the vice president in charge of overseas production was such a large man, tall, large, broad, and blunt, his back a slow-moving hole in production's daytime hallways, was also florid, craggy, an executive old enough to be literally senior. The account representative recognized almost instantly that it was the vice president in charge of overseas production who emerged from the executive garage's opposite elevator and clicked and jangled his way stiffly towards the account representative's focus, the big older man's head cocked as at an unheard pitch, distracted, his quite large body queerly and slantedly slowed, halting, listing, failing to satisfy a clear disposition to briskness, moving only via a shift of weight from side to side, a humanoid balloon with too much air, bearing his heavy, slender, leather-handled case toward the solid black Brougham that sat next to the account representative's sprightly and helmeted cycle, all the while feeling at something in the front of his topcoat with a hand full of tissues and keys. The account representative bent back to the involved removal of his securely clamped helmet. He was preparing to feel that male and special feeling associated with the conversational imperative faced by any two men with some professional connection who meet in nighttime across an otherwise empty and silent but fragilely silent underground space far below the tall and vaguely pulsing sight of a long and weary day for both. The obligation of conversation without the conversational prerequisites of intimacy or interests or concerns to share. They shared pain, though of course neither knew. Bent to the decapitation of his cycle, the account representative was choosing words neither dismissive nor inviting, neither terse nor intrusive. He was composing a carefully casual face, narrowing salutary options toward a sort of landlocked hello that contained already an acknowledgment of distance and an easy willingness to preserve same. Bent, he composed the flesh of his face, shaped a cool but respectfully cool, and by no stretch of the imagination pained eye with which to meet the inevitable eye of the vice president in charge of overseas production. The opposite elevator's door trundled shut. Things inside ascended, sounding. The vice president in charge of overseas production was still distant enough to produce echoes, but was, peripherally, still bearing down, slowly, a balloon, a glacier, on the account representative, who lifted his face's composition from the, at last, amputated helmet and turned from the white cycle to the approach of the senior executive. The vice president in charge of overseas production, he saw, having been bearing down, his jangled hand to his topcoat front, had now stopped. He now stood, stock still, lifting his thick neck and large head to nothing, as an animal keens to the waft of a warning scent. The account representative looked, then watched, as the vice president in charge of overseas production stood, frozen, inflated, and grimaced. The senior executive grimaced at a point behind and apparently just above the account representative, as if parsing an auto antenna's rune on the scratched 8'3" clearance of the executive garage's ceiling. The vice president in charge of overseas production stood, grimaced, rooted just beyond perfect asymptotic force. He balanced heavily, grimaced again, dropped a noisy, slender briefcase, and placed both hands over a vague concavity that seemed, a bit blurrily, to have appeared on the double-breasted front of his top coat. He grabbed at himself as do those in pain. He seemed to fold himself in two, his whole body curving out and around the apparent pain of his coat's front divot. He emitted what sounded like a gargle, trebled by echo. The account representative watched as the vice president in charge of overseas production pirouetted, raked a raw, clean streak in a cement pillar's soot, and clipped a wrong way sign's weighted concrete donut with a roundabout heel as he pirouetted, reached out at air, hunched, crumpled, and fell. He seemed to fall, the account representative remarked, watching, surprised out of time, at about half the rate the average thing takes to fall. The vice president in charge of overseas production, gargling, holding his chest's recession, fell with a slow grace to the exhausted floor of the executive garage, where he proceeded to writhe. Luckily, the account representative knew CPR. In time, alert, composed, svelte, lithe, well-kept, independent, now a lone wolf, though an efficient wolf, in life's gray forest, less cold by far than smoothly efficacious, he was, in a Samaritan shot, across the stony yardage between his slender case and unhelmeted cycle and the vice president in charge of overseas production, straddling the writhing huge blunt older man who was, at this new close emergency range, now revealed to the account representative to have large facial pores, blankly kind eyes, and a delicate capillary web of red in his jowls, his mouth fishily agape, forehead toad white and sickly sour, chin lost in a pool of his own throat's meat, hands rattling a rhythmless beat against the breasts of his clothes, faint mewed gargles lost in the troubled echoes of the account representative's immediate and repeated calls for help from above. Clothes, coat, gray knit suit seemed to be spreading loose from the supine senior executive, spreading like water, thought the account representative, an inveterate thrower of stones at the skins of ponds, spreading as water retreats in rings from what's disturbed its center. The account representative, throughout this interval, from the moment the pillar and sign were streaked and clipped, had been shouting for help in the empty executive garage. His shouts, the supine vice president in charge of overseas productions gargles, and attendant echoes were making for a sum noise total whose dimensions, seemingly limitless here in the enclosed executive garage, were such that the account representative would have been nonplussed and surprised to the point of outright denial. As he tilted the big, craggy, large-pored head back over a fulcrum of palm and used a clean, slender finger to clear the stricken executive's cervically pink throat of tongue and foreign matter. How little of the cacophonous and seemingly total sound of his calls for help were carrying curved up the tiny exit ramp and oozing through rare chinks in the bunkered ceiling of the executive garage and sounding on the vacant staff level, to say nothing of negotiating the now reversed spiral of the ramp, or escaping the quite thick concrete walls of the staff garage into the silent but well-lit business district street above, across which two lovers walked, stately, pale as dolls, arms woven, silent, listening for but hearing always no real difference in the city's constant, distant nighttime traffic's hiss and sigh. Meanwhile, below the staff garage, below the street, in the hugely echoing and deserted executive garage, the account representative had ripped the spreading cloth from the queer recession and was positively having at the vice president in charge of overseas productions' defective heart. He administered CPR, beating at the soft dent of a chest's breastbone, alternating quartered beatings with infusions of breath down the senior stricken executive's full, but faintly blue, lips and tilted head, and into the rising sunken chest. The chest falling, the account representative taking affordable time and breath at every possible fourth beat pause to call help in the directions of the quiet street as, using CPR, he kept the vice president in charge of overseas production minimally alive until help could arrive, as he had been trained and certified by the petite new bohemian, almond-eyed Red Cross volunteer instructor by whom he remembered all the students had volunteered to be straddled and infused, and whom the account representative had, one spontaneous and quartz-lit evening, bought a cup of coffee and a slice of 9-grain toast, and had asked to the sales trainee's annual formal, and had married, certified by her to do, one never knowing when it could save a life, he seduced utterly by his fiancée's dictum that you erred, in doubt, always on the side of prepared care and readiness to preserve minimal life function, until help could arrive. His arms and lumbar beginning now to burn as he bent at the supine senior executive, pausing to call help again and loosen his own stiff collar, sweat moving oily on the tight skin beneath his own newer lined topcoat and gray knit clothes, his own breath coming harder as he kept the incapacitated vice president in charge of overseas production minimally alive, pending the arrival of help at well past 10, amid complete emptiness, calling help unheard. The happily married and blankly kind grandfather of one person's own life, now literally the junior executive's, to have and to hold for a lifetime, amid swirls of long-forgotten exhaust, beneath the composed and watchful eye of his decapitated cycle's light. Help, the account representative continued to call, during affordable fourths in the artificial circulatory maintenance of the supine, straddled, and infused vice president in charge of overseas production, stricken amid a flat swirl of disturbed cloth spreading out, still, slowly against the cemented monoxide floor. Help, the working account representative called, feeling the stir of a tinnily remembered humid wind and pausing, again, to look behind him, past the Brugham's black hood and the carelessly dropped safety helmet beside the white cycle, at the ramp that spiraled up out of sight toward a street empty and bright, before the building, empty and bright, dispossessed, autonomous, and autonomic. Bent to what 2 lives required, below everything, he called for help, again and again.